Thank you, Dick. Friends here and on Zoom, welcome. As Dick has said, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Mark Zernzak, who is a senior social justice advocate in the Uniting Church Synod of Victoria, Tasmania. I've recently and over the next little while as well, I've had a couple of conversations with Mark, partly as we prepare for this, but also I'm aware that he's about to have a role as usual at the Victoria Tasmania Synod meetings. So there's a public sense of that. The other day, I and a few others became aware of Mark's work beyond the gathered congregations and gathered institution, if you like, of the church, as we met with one of our local members of parliament in advocacy for a particular situation of a failure of the system, I suppose, is the best way to put it. I won't go into any details, obviously, but one of the things that I noticed there was the relationship that Mark creates and has with not only parliamentarians, but people in all sorts of circles, both within and beyond organised church, to work for justice. So it's not simply a lecture tour telling the rest of us what to do. Mark is very much in there in the midst of it. And his networking and so forth is very important and very helpful to the church on that kind of basis. I just a moment ago asked him how he was going, and he said, I'm just taking a little bit of a breather before Parliament kicks in, or before Parliament resets, because there's all sorts of things that happen there. So that'll give an idea of some of what Mark is involved in. When we were thinking about today, what we particularly wanted to suggest was that it may surprise you all, but we had an election recently, and we thought that a few weeks after whatever government was formed, whoever formed it, it might be good to think about some of the justice issues that are in play, and maybe some that look different with the change of government, other things that are very much continuing to be on the horizon, no matter who's sitting in Canberra. So we asked Mark to give us some input in that. I hasten to add, this isn't a partisan thing. It's around across party lines and none, I guess. But the impetus for people of faith to be thinking about justice issues and justice practices is one that is very important. So we thought, let's hit it now. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Mark to say thank you for coming to join us, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I've got to say I did approach this with a fair bit of trepidation today, because I've had lots of people approach me knowing that this event was coming up and telling me they were going to watch it, and lots of people who I know are very clever and very well thought out. So I thought this is going to be a challenging talk to give to this audience. So hopefully I'll give you some things to think about. I should also set up the theological framing that I'll be working from, probably just having recently read, and I'm probably a little bit behind others in this, I've just recently read Voss and Crossman on a public theology, and their argument that effectively theology should have a focus on how do we create a flourishing world, how do we create flourishing life for people. So that is the focus, that is the lens, the theological lens, the theological frame through which I'll be addressing the various justice issues that might come up. The other thing I'd probably stress is I'd probably look at, I'm only going to give you a bit of a sense of issues as the ones that we're looking at from the Uniting Church. So it is a bit of a Uniting Church perspective on this. I do know for many churches, though, the common issues that are of concern tend to be ecumenical, particularly from a sort of social justice space. But I will point out, I'm struck by the complexity and the need to engage with complexity around some of these issues, and I will touch on that, which also will mean, to some degree, I might say some things today that may not be popular for this audience, but I'm happy to have that tested. And I'm always open to having that conversation. Recently, another book I really recommend is Adam Grant's Think Again. So he's a psychologist. There's a lovely chapter in here called The Joy of Being Wrong. And was quite struck by that because it actually points out that being open to getting it wrong is one of the spaces where you learn the most. And I remember I kind of shocked an advisor to Richard D. Natali at the time, where we'd been lobbying for them to take a particular position on a bill. They chose to take an alternative position. As it turns out, it was a bit of a guessing game as to which way the Morrison government was going to play on this particular bill. They got it right, I got it wrong. I contacted them afterwards and I said, thank you very much for ignoring my lobbying. I really appreciate that you made the right call and I was on the wrong side of that. And that got quite a bit of a chuckle from an advisor, because they're not, I guess, normally used to people who are going to acknowledge when they get it wrong. The other thing I am going to I'll start with a framing that looks at some of the international issues, and I'm deliberately choosing to do that because one of the things that strikes me is over my time, and I've worked for the Synod now for 23 years, and from when I started, there was a very strong movement within the church and a very strong cohort that had a real focus and a real passion for international justice and a real focus in that space. And over time, I've noticed that has enormously diminished. When I first started, the World Council of Churches was quite a significant body. It was probably already in decline, but that path of decline appears to have continued. I've seen that with some of our regional ecumenical bodies, and that's reflected in the secular world as well. We've become more inward looking. I don't think the pandemic has helped in that space. The world feels like it's become more tribal, that we don't, and I think that's one of the things that Christian theology should be bringing, is an outward looking, a desire for the flourishing of all of humanity and the globe, and that includes our natural environment as well. So I will start with the international and then I'll move back to talking about some of the domestic issues. And focusing it in the frame of, obviously we have a new Labor government, and what does that mean? So that is the other part of the lens that I was speaking to. So picking up probably one of the biggest issues, of course, is the whole issue of climate justice, climate change, and obviously that is a space where we have seen a positive move from Labor. It is a more muted though than probably we would have seen had there been. I think one of the lessons Labor took out of their defeat in the 2019 election was a belief that they'd gone too far to the left. And this was kind of interesting because, you know, Bill Shorten is seen as being on the right faction of the Labor Party, yet we now have someone from the left faction, Anthony Albanese, who had a more right-wing agenda that was taken to the last election compared to what we had under Bill Shorten. And certainly that meant we've seen a bit more of a muted response on climate change. I think the positive side of this is Labor is committed to more domestic action. I think, you know, they are committing to a higher target in terms of emission reductions. Hopefully we will see a consistent energy policy that will allow for certainty for the direction we need to move in terms of shifting the basis of our economy away from fossil fuels to a more renewable basis. Environmental groups are talking about, you know, the need to electrify everything, and I think hopefully we're going to see a federal government more in that space. The part that's probably going to be that is going to be a challenge and probably will still be disappointing under a Labor government is all the signals so far are that they are going to continue backing fossil fuel developments for export. So I think the concern here is that we will see ongoing development of new coal mines, new gas exports will continue in that space. All the signals they've publicly sent in that space seem to indicate that direction. And I think that, you know, that's going to be disappointing. I think that the area where there might be some room to move is whether they can be persuaded to not follow through on the subsidies that the Morrison government had previously committed to actually prop up some of these developments. So you might at least get some hope that they'll say, well, we won't stand in the way of these developments, but we're not going to pump government money in to prop them up and actually make them viable. And that would at least see some of these developments not go ahead. On the bigger challenge, I mean, I think our global systems, though, continue to keep people in poverty and depression. And so the question is, how does the Labor government respond to that? I think on the positive side, we've seen an Australian government willing to engage. One of the big areas we've worked on is tax justice. Tax is one of the main methods that we can try and see development and addressing of poverty. If you want to look at scale, generally overseas aid and development from wealthy countries providing that aid, it's typically in the order of about $140 billion US a year, around that number. I haven't checked the latest number, but it's normally been around that. By comparison, developing country taxes are 7,700 US billion a year. So you can see there's a lot more ability. And by and large, if you go and talk to most of the advocates for reform in developing countries, they're going to tell you they'd much rather have a revenue base of their own to decide their own development than be dependent on the charity of wealthy countries and have wealthy donors direct what kind of development takes place. So look, Australia has been supporting that, supported under the Morrison government. I suspect that's going to continue, hopefully under a Shorten government. One of the big developments there is multinational companies. There's a move to large multinational companies having to pay a minimum rate of tax of 15%, no matter where they are. That's a bit of a game changer in that space. The unfortunate thing is we've seen with some of these international tax developments, tax justice outcomes, often the developing countries get left out of them. So there'll be a bit of a challenge there around that. On our trade system, we've just in this last week, we've seen a disappointing outcome with the World Trade Organization making a decision. There was a move to try and get a waiver on technologies related to the COVID pandemic, and effectively the WTO has kind of given a partial waiver, but I think most of the groups concerned about public health would say actually what they decided actually just simply reinforces the existing rules, will continue to favour the multinational pharmaceutical companies, and I don't think Australia played a very positive role in shifting that. In the other positive space on the international fronts, we have seen quite a shift in terms of addressing modern slavery, and that's been a really positive move. I remember when I first started, it was a Labor government, and we went to them and we talked about the problems of child labour in production of goods that were coming into Australia. And the kind of response we got from the Commonwealth government at that stage as a Labor government was, that's a problem for the countries where the goods are being produced. It's got nothing to do with us as the consumers of those goods. That was by and large what we interpreted the response to be. I think over time we've seen a shift just in the whole of Australian politics that actually now says we do accept some responsibility in the way goods are made and when they're brought in here, goods and services. We've seen the Modern Slavery Act in place. That is up for review at the moment. Labor has committed to introduce an independent anti-slavery commissioner, which is a really positive thing. And they're also talking about providing more advice to business, identifying what kind of goods and places they're coming from, where slavery is of a greater impact. So that, and you know, I think that'll be strengthened under a Labor government. What's probably less obvious, and at this stage we'll need to wait and see how this plays. There has been a global move towards addressing corruption globally. And again, that's really positive for developing countries in terms of promoting good governance and allowing people to benefit from their own governments. In this space, Labor's been less positive, interestingly, than under a coalition government. So the previous coalition government did try to put through a bill for 2 terms of office that would have improved responses to bribery, to foreign bribery, and Labor blocked that piece of legislation for, I think, not for good reasons. There's also some concern. One of the gaps we have in Australia, we're only one of 4 countries in the world that has, on their anti-money laundering laws, has not brought lawyers, accountants, real estate agents in under our anti-money laundering laws. So Australia kind of took a view, we did what's called tranche 1. So we sort of said, look, we'll allow our financial system to be the front line of our defence against money laundering. And this impacts on developing countries because it's about assets being stolen out of developing countries and shifted into Australia. And they've sort of said, well, we'll allow the banking system and the financial system to do the heavy lifting. So the idea is the banks and financial institutions need to inspect transactions as they come in and identify are any of them suspicious, and then report them to our financial intelligence unit, AUSTRAC, for then possible action from a money laundering point of view. Your problem with that is people are able to get around that. If they can find a way past the financial system, so people turning up with suitcases of money, and you know, we hear of this just over in Narre Warren, there was the son of a South Sudanese general who bought a huge mansion while being on social security payments here in Australia. That was, I think it was a 1.5 million mansion, which managed to bypass the banking system, is my knowledge on that. And so you see this. So the idea is bringing to real estate agents, lawyers, accountants who would otherwise facilitate these transactions. On that front, Labor is quite close to the Law Council, who have opposed being brought in under the system. So we'll need to wait and see how that one works out. The other one that's been quite passionate for us has been online exploitation. The online world is quite a challenge in the sense of, particularly the issue we've been looking at is child sexual abuse in the online world. And for Australia, one of the biggest issues is live streaming. So this is where an Australian online, it's largely into the Philippines, they will direct the abuse they want inflicted on a child and they'll make a payment for that. So the payment is normally through a remittance service into the Philippines, and the abuse will occur in real time live in that space. Now, for the previous government introduced quite a lot of reform in this space. They tried to take on the big tech companies around a lot of the abuse that is occurring in the online world. And interestingly, the opposition has actually come from civil liberty and human rights groups who have tended to argue that online freedom outweighs the need to address the sexual abuse and other forms of abuse that are occurring in the online world. And it's a very odd, I've always found this a very odd position, and I can't get my head around the only thing that seems to hold the position together is a distrust of law enforcement full stop in the online world. That's the only thing that seems consistent, because if you, on the one hand, they'll say, well, we don't like some of these laws because it's about privacy for the online, people in the online world. But when previously under the Labor government, they went to say, well, internet service providers should block ready access to images and videos of people who have been sexually abused in the online world. These same groups, which is about the privacy rights of the victims of the sexual abuse in this case, these civil liberty and human rights groups said, no, that's completely inappropriate interference with freedom of expression in the online world by having this. So you kind of go, well, hang on, so you're not for the privacy rights of victims of abuse, but when laws will now impact on the people perpetrating the abuse, then you'll uphold the privacy rights of the abusers. It's a very odd position to take in this space, and I'm happy to speak more about this. I think it was one of the things, look, of all the failings of the Morrison government, it was actually a space that, my test of when do you know if the government really cares about an issue? It's when they actually pursue something and there's no electoral credit for it, and pretty much nobody notices. And for the Morrison government, for all their failings, the one area they did do a lot was willing to take on the big multinational tech companies and that online world space. And they introduced a whole lot of reforms in that space and pretty much got no credit from the electorate for doing that. I mean, Scott Morrison himself would go to G20 meetings and be putting this issue about needing to address abuse and human rights violations online to those meetings. And again, as I said, got almost no credit for that. So that's kind of an interesting space there. On people seeking asylum, this will be an area where Labor and refugees, Labor has got a positive, we'll see some really positive reforms here. I think we're going to see an end to temporary protection visas and safe haven enterprise visas, both of which have left people in limbo for long periods of time. So this is people who arrive by boat, they were put on 5-year visas that had to be renewed every 5 years. Labor said we're going to end those. They've also said we're going to increase the intake of refugees from the current 13,750 up to 27,000. So it's pretty much a doubling of the refugee intake. They have said to us that's not going to happen in the first term in office, so there'll be a steady increase over time. I think to my mind that makes sense. One of the things we do want to do is see refugee resettlement done well. And there will be, to try and double the program, say if you said, well, we're just going to double it in the next year, I think there'd be a real worry that the systems of support would not cope with that rapid increase. So there does need to be some moderation around that. The other thing they're allowing for, which again, the previous government was already moving in this direction, is more opportunity for community sponsorship of refugees. So community groups will have more ability to actually fund extra people coming. Well, people coming. Under the previous government, it would have been within the existing cap. I think the hope with Labor, they've talked about, they'll have the 27,000 refugees, and then community sponsorship will allow for another 5,000. So it'll be an additional group. And that's a positive outcome. The thing they will continue is deterrence of boat arrivals. I think that's there's a valid discussion to have around that. There are definitely risks of people coming by boat, of drowning. That's legitimate. And if you're increasing the intake overall, it's a valid discussion to be having around that space. I should say in this space too, the other thing I would say is, and out of our experience, we do see there are a lot of people who are currently misusing the protection system. So if you look at Australia, we have between 25 to 30,000 people apply for protection every year. Most of those have arrived by plane from Asian countries, and they get rejected by the department. They go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. From certain countries, about 95% of them get rejected. Now, knowing some of the members who are actually very sympathetic to refugees, they're not being rejected because the people in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal are nasty people who don't want to grant refugee status. It is actually, there is no merit to some of the claims being made. And then, of course, it goes to the federal court. And when you play that system as it currently stands, because the system is clogged, and you get a bridging visa with work rights, you can probably get 5 to 8 years. You get a 5 to 8 year work visa effectively by applying for protection that has no merit. And we see this because we do a lot of work with the Pacific Islanders out on farms. Just this week, I dealt with a group of workers, the local farmers, giving them a letter saying, hey, if you pay me $9,000, I'll try and get you onto another visa and you can come off the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. And we've seen migration agents targeting workers to try and, pay us $2,500, pay us $5,000. We'll file a meritless protection claim for you. You'll get a bridging visa. You can go and work anywhere you like then, instead of being tied to the employer under the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, PALM scheme. So we're seeing it very much on the ground, and you look at the statistics. By comparison, if I look at New Zealand, they only get about they get 500 applications for protection every year. So even if you say, well, look at the population difference, and you go, well, that's 5 times the population, that's only 2,500. So there's an order of magnitude difference in applications in New Zealand. And one of the main differences that appears to be there is they only give you work rights for 6 months. Now that said, this is not an easily solvable problem. And again, happy to talk about this, because when we used to not give people work rights after they'd applied for protection, those who had a legitimate claim for protection, who the department wrongly didn't grant asylum to, were left in absolute destitution, and churches and other charities had to prop them up in that space. Moving on to other issues. So I've touched on some of the international issues. We could talk about some of the international relations stuff, but I'll leave that for the moment. Other things that I think are really important to think about are democracy, just generally. So one of the issues we've seen globally across Western countries is a decline in trust in democracy as a system. And that's been, now people in Australia sort of think, well, it's because of all the chaos we've had in prime ministers and we keep changing prime ministers or not. But that doesn't explain why we've seen this global trend of declining trust in the democratic system. Interestingly, there was a slight upward tick during the pandemic. So it was kind of like, I think most people sort of ended up feeling like, well, governments actually, by and large, did deliver, and we became dependent on governments to help address the pandemic across Western countries. So you sort of saw a slight increase, but there has been a global decline in trust. I think the analysis of this, probably I'd point you to a really good book by William Davies called Nervous States, where he sort of says, look, the Enlightenment project failed. In a sense, Enlightenment sort of said to people, look, here's this, we're going to do everything rationally, we've got all this scientific stuff, and life is going to improve for everybody. And what's happened is, for a lot of people at the bottom of society, for a lot of people in low socioeconomic groups, that's not their experience of life. They've gone, they've done their education, and they suddenly find they're working 3 gig economy jobs, and life does not feel easy. It does not feel better. The Enlightenment project that promised them progress and a better future has not delivered. In real terms, wages have gone backwards in a number of countries, particularly the US. And in this point, another book I will point you to is quite a good book, The Profit Paradox, which is actually pointing out, there's part of the main issue I want to raise out of this one is pointing out that while corporate profits continue to, what this author through their analysis is looking at, while corporate profits continue up, wages have been on a downward pressure. And he gives a lovely story at the start of the book, talks about, he's got a problem with his mobile phone, goes through 2 initial contact people to try and help him fix his phone problem. Nothing happens, and ends up being put onto their technical specialist. And the technical specialist, over a period of 3 weeks, probably spends, I can't remember, it's about 3 or 4 hours with him. And he sort of goes, wow, this person must be, you know, they surely would be paying this technical specialist about $100 an hour or something to do this work, or $50 an hour or whatever. And he kind of figures out, by the amount of time she spent, it would have been cheaper to give him a handset, a brand new handset. So he decides afterwards to ring her up after the problem's fixed and asks her about how much she's being paid, and she's getting about $15 an hour. And he suddenly realises why. So while the telephone company's making huge profits, this person who actually had, I think 2 degrees and a postgraduate qualification is sort of on $15 an hour. The other thing we've got is in our democracy, we've seen much greater polarisation. And again, Zimil Zaki covers this very well. He's written a book on empathy. He talks about there's studies in the US that actually shows over time, when you ask people, would you be willing to pay money not to hear the views of your political opponents, that has increased in the US. So more people are saying, I would actually pay money not to have to listen to those I politically disagree with, which is that sign of polarisation. And I don't think that serves us well. I think, look, there are really important issues for us from a social justice point of view, from a human rights point of view, that we want to say, yes, we need to move forward on those, and it's important to see reform in that space. But I think that process of dialogue and bringing people along is really important if you're going to get reforms that stick, and if you're going to have the ability to persuade people. And generally, reforms only stick if the whole population sort of moves in that space. And if you want to think about, some of the big shifts in our population, like I talked about before, the modern slavery thing, going from even under a Labor government saying, well, if there's modern slavery or child labour in the production of goods, it's not our problem, through to now both sides of politics saying actually is our problem. Or you look at the shift in terms of marriage equality, that whole debate, the society, the set point of society has actually shifted. And that's when it sticks, because it doesn't matter who's in office, because if the set point of society shifted, it's going to be very hard for any government of whatever persuasion to unwind those things. Now, that's talked about the problem. There are solutions, and I think the really exciting bit in the democracy space, I'll point to, again, book by Rosalind Fuller, In Defence of Democracy, exploring how could you actually, what's been found is people have more trust in democracy if there's a greater ability to participate in the democratic system. So if you can actually find ways to allow people to participate in mass, then you actually get greater respect for democracy. The other thing that makes people trust democracy is when they feel the government services are good quality. So if they actually feel like we're getting good quality services, then trust in democracy is much higher in that space. Rosalind Fuller explores, a whole bunch of ways you might use the online world to actually allow for people to participate more. She kicks around ideas, should we actually think about, should people be paid to vote, for example? So that, now that makes more sense in a voluntary voting system, but her argument is if you're on low income, actually getting out to a polling booth in a voluntary voting system actually takes you away from other things. So if you actually can, if you were paid, it might mean you can actually get childcare, you can, there might be things you're able to then that actually facilitate you being able to go and participate in the political system. I think it's less relevant for us in a compulsory voting system, which is why I think compulsory voting is a really good thing that we have. The other thing is participation in the public service. There's been some really great work done by the public service at the Commonwealth level. There are some documents they have that talk about how to increase participation in the democratic process. A lot of those are they're really exciting. They've kind of got this mapping out of the ultimate is, wherever possible, try and do co-design. And they've recognised the problem. They say, as government, the experience for most people normally is, we invite you, we go out and we do a consultation. So we say, tell us your views. you feed in your views to us, and then it disappears into, from your perspective, a black box. And at some later point in time, 6 months down the track, an answer pops out of the black box, and you've got no idea where did that answer appear from, because you've got no idea what the rules inside the black box were. So the public service is saying, well, we need to allow more people to get inside the black box and at least know what the rules inside that box are. Or even better, where possible, have the people who are going to be affected by the decision being part of the decision-making process. Now, obviously, you need to be a bit cautious about that. I'm not sure I really want multinational tobacco companies having a seat at the table deciding about what the public health measures in response to tobacco should be. But that said, I think, you know, broadly bringing in more of the population into that sort of decision-making is really important. Economically, so I think Labor's got some challenges there about what are they going to do in this democracy space. Look, the final thing I'll throw out there too is, as we move towards a more multi-party parliament, do we need to start thinking about broader constitutional reform? Our system does not work well in accepting a multi-party system. You might want to, you know, we could start thinking about, well, what kind of reforms would we need that would embrace more of a multi-party system? Because currently, to have an effective executive, you need a majority in the legislative arm of government. And as you can see, you know, if we look at Israel, 5 elections in 4 years is what happens if you have a multi-party system where people don't get along and can't agree for longer periods of time to work together. So the system can work if people have goodwill, but it relies on goodwill unless you think about some reforms. On the economic side, now, Labor has locked itself into some revenue problems. It has decided it is following through on the tax cuts that will give a whole lot of money away to wealthy people in Australia. It's locked those in. It's ruled out a whole bunch of tax reform that would make our system more progressive. It said we're not going to touch negative gearing. We're not going to touch the capital gains tax discount. We're not going to play with making the superannuation tax system fairer. They have ruled out a whole lot of things. They have also said we're going to lock in military expenditure at 2% of GDP. So again, you're tying your hands. So it's going to be interesting to see how are they going to deliver on reforms that actually make our lives better. And maybe they can do that in some places, but if they're going to do that in some places with all the restraints they put on themselves, the worry is where are they going to take it from to make that happen in that space. And look, and, you know, the corporates are not going to give up on their, you know, the big multinational corporations and a lot of the businesses in Australia. The solution to every problem is a corporate tax cut. I don't think that thinking is not going to go away for them, so they will continue to pursue that line. Fortunately, that has been unpopular with the general public, and I'm thinking that hopefully will stay the way, so it'll be hard for any parliament to deliver on that, which is good. In terms of First Nations, look, we are going to see some reforms there. Obviously, Labor's been very upfront, really positively about a voice to Parliament. We should see I'm not saying anything here you probably don't already know, we should see a referendum on that at some time. That'll be positive. I think the challenge there is what kind of debate will occur around that space, what kind of nasty negative campaign might be run. And again, you know, in this space, probably one of the really negative forces from my point of view is the News Corp columnists. So the opinion editors in papers like the Herald Sun and the Australian, who I think the election demonstrated they may not be able to decide who gets elected in our society, which is great news, but unfortunately they still have a disproportionate ability to set the public conversation. And I think that's a really negative role they play in our society, unfortunately. And I think they will run a very negative, a very harmful, very nasty position on this voice to Parliament. And you've probably already heard some of the language they've used around that. The other 2 bits of this process, though, are the truth process and possibility of treaty. Now, Victoria's already kind of been leading on this. We've already got a Truth Commission coming up. We're already moving down the process of treaty. Hopefully the Commonwealth might follow in that process. The fly in the ointment on this is the Greens have now indicated they may want to, they've sort of said, well, we think there's an order to this process that we want to see, and we don't think have a voice to Parliament is the first thing that should be done. So it might be kind of a bit weird if the Greens now decide they're going to run against a voice to Parliament because they're thinking it's the wrong order. So we'll need to just wait and see how that plays out. We did have it, and I chaired the electoral forum in Melbourne that the local churches there held, and Adam Bant was the person, and he actually spoke on that issue. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays. The other positive Labor has promised is getting rid of the community development program. So this is the kind of work for the dole in remote and regional areas. It has been highly racially discriminatory against First Nations people. Labor has promised to scrap it. That was already the direction, I've got to say, the Morrison government was under, but I think we'll see Labor move on it much quicker, and there'll be a redesign of support for people, First Nations people who are unemployed, which will be done in co-design with First Nations people. That's the hope, that's the promise. Hopefully they'll follow through on that one. On poverty and social security, obviously we've heard the Albanese government saying, well, we can't afford to do anything about social security payments immediately. We will look into it beyond our first budget. As I said, I think the big constraint there is going to be the revenue problems they've already locked in. The other thing, probably looking back, my experience of the Gillard-Rudd years was, probably a little bit of bitterness on my part that we did see a neoliberal philosophy creeping in that I missed, that you kind of snuck under the radar. So we saw a change in the way the registered training organisations were implemented, and that was a disaster where we kind of opened it up and made it a market system, and we saw a whole lot of rorting of that system. Similarly, the way the NDIS ended up being designed was largely to try and create an artificial market, which is a very neoliberal philosophy. The solution to everything is create a free market. There would have been other designs you could have done that would have improved the old system support for people with disability that didn't need to go to the market system. I won't go into the details here. I'm more than happy if someone wants to ask me any questions about that or have a discussion. I'm happy to go into why I think there are some serious flaws in the design of the NDIS, and those problems have played out. So I do think there will need to be a bit of guarding from my perspective if you've got a progressive mind towards watching out, are Labor going to try and sneak something in that's about neoliberal marketisation, because that is certainly a thinking that does exist within the party at times. On housing, look, housing is one of those really, really big intractable problems. I will point you to, there's a recent report that Per Capita put out on housing. They point out, if you look at when John Howard introduced the capital gains tax discount, the kind of line, you sort of have this line of wages and line of house prices, and they pretty much followed each other. When the capital gains tax discount was introduced, housing prices went on this way and wages went that way. So affordability has become a substantial problem because of the way the tax decisions that were made at that period that have made it super incentivised investment in housing for profit, not for affordability. And we keep having this sort of fantasy language out in the community. The governments tell us they can fix housing affordability without house prices having to come down. Now, to my mind, that's a magic pudding solution that I have no idea how that's going to work, and you end up with silly comments, as some ministers in the previous government said, well, if you want to get into the housing market, just get a better job. Right? Now, pretty notorious comment there, not very useful. So we need a substantial investment in public housing to really bring down those. It's a state Commonwealth issue. It does affect both governments. It is a major challenge. And again, going back to that, those revenue constraints Labor has locked themselves into means it'll be interesting to see, can they move in that space? Aged care is the other place. They've indicated reforms. I will say that I think that does need the implementation of the full recommendations of the Royal Commission into aged care, not just about increasing wages and increasing the ratio of nurses. That'll certainly help, but there needs to be safeguards against aged care providers gaming the system. I know a lot of them are screaming they can't make it work. At the same time, if you look at some of the larger aged care providers and you compare them to their international equivalents, their profitability is much higher in Australia than it is in other jurisdictions overseas. So there's quite a bit of debate around there, and I think if you're going to put more money and support into the aged care system, and that, I should say, also shouldn't just be about residential care, it is about allowing people to live in the community as well. That is part of the aged care system that's really important as well. Family violence. Look, there is a current plan. I'm intrigued that I know quite a lot of advocates critique the current plan. If you've had a chance to look at it, it actually does say all the right things. Pretty much the public servants who wrote it are all pretty much women. Having met quite a lot of them, at least to my knowledge. So there's quite a lot in there that you'd sort of say is good. The big issue I thought was actually how you're going to find the funding to make it work. So, for example, you know, one of the big issues and one of the big demands on housing is people having to flee abusive relationships and giving them stable, ongoing housing. Again, that requires a massive investment, and that was the bit in the plan that I actually thought was most missing. I would have thought most of what was in the plan is reasonable. I've been looking at what people are saying about it. The critiques feel a bit vague to my mind in that space. One area that we've focused on as churches is about people on temporary visas who experience family violence. That's an area that needs reform. There was already stuff that was starting to happen under the previous government. Hopefully the momentum for that will continue under the new government. Look, the final area I'll probably pick up on is on employment and industrial relations. I think, you know, we have the Labor is talking about, I think we'll see some positive moves in that space. My only comment in this is, I'm probably one of those struck by the idea that, so there's a particular book, The Future is Jobless. So the notion that over time, we actually might find as a society, we actually don't need people to work 50-hour weeks, right? And ideally, you'd actually say, what would be wrong with a society where if all the labour we needed was 25 hours, everyone worked 25 hours a week, and then you had all that other time to spend with family and do other things in your life? Is that a bad outcome? If that was what was needed, if 25 hours a week met all the needs we had, so yet we seem to be locked into this philosophy. The ideal we need to be at is working people as many hours as we possibly can squeeze out of them. And I'm not quite sure why that is philosophically the position. And I'm a little bit worried at times, you know, what we hear from Labor is this language about let's go back to the 1950s and manufacture everything here and we'll create jobs and we'll sort of, you know, we'll put everybody back into full employment. And I'm wondering, that is a possible solution, but should we be thinking about a wider approach to this and thinking about what does the future of work look like? And could we create a society where you do less paid work? And you know, the distribution of work is really important in this, because you could also see a world in which you have a whole bunch of people working 70-hour weeks and a whole bunch of people who have no work at all, barely eking out a living. That's the kind of dystopian future. I think the more utopian vision would be, we think about the distribution of work as well. And on that front, I will, this one passed me by, Donut Economics, really good read. So this is a kind of philosophical position. It does offer one view of an alternative to economics, and there's a movement, the Renew movement, which has actually picked this up, and they've got a branch here in Melbourne, for example. And the philosophical position, the donut here is about, at the lower end, you sort of say, well, we need a sufficient economic activity to meet the legitimate human needs. And there's an upper bound that says this is the ecological limits of what we can do in terms of economic activity. So the ring is kind of this happy place where you're meeting essential human need while staying within the ecological limits. And there's lovely critique in here of, you know, the notion of Homo economicus, which is the sort of basis of capitalist and neoliberal economics. So Homo economicus was the sort of model of humanity that fits with the sort of capitalist model. So it's a dollar sign for your heart, a calculator for your head, and you're constantly thinking about what decision will give me the maximum benefit and the maximum profit. And real humans aren't like that. Real humans actually care about other people and are creative and aren't always looking for what will give them the maximum advantage for themselves over others. So I'm going to stop there and move to the break. Is that?
Rightio, friends. Time to begin again. Okay. I think probably if you come up here. Right, now this is the opportunity for the question and answer session or a discussion, to the extent that we can have a discussion between a live audience and a virtual audience. So if those of you on that are zooming in, if you use the chat facility to send a short question or a short statement, Greg will direct traffic and so that those here physically can understand what's being said and hear Mark's response. Now, starting perhaps with somebody actually here in the physical audience, is there a question for Mark?
Thank you very much. The overwhelming array of your topics was astounding. I'm wondering about the moral compass of the new government, because I think with all the policies, especially after they came in, their immediate actions gave the impression of putting moral responsibility first. The first thing that Albanese mentioned was the voice to Parliament, things like that. What do you think that their moral sustainability will be like in the reality of the political system?
Look, I do think, the things they really ran on, I think, were responding to the community. And I think in that sense, they were really positive. The voice to Parliament is one, their inclination to move much quicker and more, have a solid plan around addressing climate change is really important in that space. I didn't even touch on the National Integrity Commission. So the idea of setting that up. So that they definitely picked up the mood of the community around certain key issues. I have every confidence that they will stick with that. I think the challenge will be in the Parliament. They don't control the Senate currently, so it'll be the skill of them negotiating and their willingness to perhaps have those discussions and dialogue. You would have probably picked up in the last day, it probably hasn't started great because they've just told the independents we're only going to give you 1 staff member instead of 4, which yeah, it does seem an odd cost saving if you need these people's goodwill when Parliament resumes and you're going to need their support. I think the challenge for Labor will be they do have, I think, having been out of office for so long, there will be a lot of things they want to get done. And I think the previous experience with Labor was they ended up, under the previous Labor government, making a lot of announcements about things they would do that they never got around to legislating. So I think that'll be a challenge for them. The federal parliament actually, compared to state parliament, actually does move pretty quickly, and particularly on non-controversial things. You can have days where they'll simply, the parties will have agreed that's a sensible thing to do, and within the space of half an hour to an hour, they can pass 7 bills. Now, in the state parliament, I've generally noticed they probably get if they're lucky through the Legislative Council, they might get 2 or 3 through in a week, and that's a productive week. So the federal parliament can pass legislation fairly quickly, but I think that'll be a challenge for them. The other thing that I think will put a restraint on, as I've kept emphasising, a restraint on their ability to do things is anything that requires revenue, given the straitjacket they've locked themselves into, and now facing the inflation having re-emerged as a bit of an issue in this space. So that'll put further brakes on anything that requires funding. The thing I didn't touch on is obviously there's a bit of a reshaping of international relations. I think that again is a positive. I think the direction they're heading in that is positive. I think the moves to building a better relationship with the Pacific is really good, and the less aggressive approach to China is also, I think, highly desirable in this space.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks, Mark. Your comments about the tax system and revenue and so forth are ones that I've long agreed with. One thing you didn't mention as you were sort of skipping through the taxes, so to speak, was GST. And I look at our shopping dockets and am often quite astounded by how little GST we actually pay, because we're able to afford to buy fresh food, fresh fruit, and that sort of stuff. And have the understanding that the GST is regressive and it hits poorer people harder than it hits people like me. Is your sense that there is any appetite for having a crack at GST reform?
From a point of view of putting it up, I would certainly hope not. In that, in that
That
space.
wasn't exactly
No,
what I was
I'm
thinking.
wondering.
No.
I'm wondering if, because there is discussion about broadening the base. So what currently has exemption, whether you exempt certain products as well. So there has been some debate around, you know, what should be in and what should be out, and then there's the rate. Now it tends to be the sort of wealthy in the business community that want to see the rate go up because they want a trade-off that says increase consumption taxes, and in return you can lower income tax, and both for corporates and for personal tax. And when they're thinking that, they're thinking the top rate as well, so that the beneficiaries are themselves in that space. So they are very much operating out of a homo economicus approach to the world when advocating for that. Look, I don't have any sense that Labor will want to take on a GST fight. Yeah, unless they, I mean, it's nothing they're flagged, and you would think, you know, the stuff they've talked about in tax reform, they are talking about chasing multinationals for more tax recovery. Look, that's really super popular. Interestingly, most of the reform was already done under the Morrison government, so there was a whole lot of reforms done to restrain tax avoidance, tax evasion. Even if I take the Oxfam figure, they sort of estimated about 8 billion to be chased. It's not nothing, but in terms of scale of return, the kind of money we need to talk about to fix some of those other problems, I talk that even if you got every cent of that, it's not going to be enough to address that. And, you know, you could get much more if you were to introduce progressive taxation on superannuation, for example, or the unfinished business is actually the shadow economy. So it's all the cash in hand stuff. But interestingly, while people are the general population, when you look at the figures, they're super happy to go after multinationals on tax evasion. When you start saying we need to go after tradies for cash in hand, the popularity of that is much, much lower. So, which is kind of interesting. I can't quite figure out why people think it's only, you know, big players who are the people we need to stop on tax evasion, but small businesses and those kind of cash in hand arrangements. And it might be, you know, for some people, they probably think, well, I pay my plumber cash in hand and I get a benefit out of that. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the philosophical difference there is, but definitely that's an area. The shadow economy was estimated to be about 50 billion. So if you looked at fixing the shadow economy, you could get a lot more cash if you could actually find ways of really addressing that.
Greg, some from...
Thanks, Dick and Mark. Just to let people here know, there's been probably about 35 or plus people viewing via Zoom. And what you can't see, but I can see, is I'm extremely envious of the Gunson's afternoon tea. Just a couple of quick comments or points that people have made while they've been watching. Ingrid Mary has referred to a guy called Dr. Lustig. I don't know if you've heard of him, talking about freedom as a research doctor. So that's just someone just pointing that out. A comment from Helen Hill. The City of Melbourne is using, I think it's donut economics to do planning for its future. There are quite a few other cities around the world who are also using it. And she's trying to apply it to certain municipalities in Timor-Leste. And does anyone here have experience of the City of Melbourne work? It's a comment, I guess, or a question as well. And Ingrid Mary points out, she says, I think she points out that people that in Totnes and Devon in England, they've been using local economic currencies and it's working well. So a question from Don and Helen Bartlett. Why do you think there's been a fundamental shift away from science to an acceptance of fake news within the developed world, despite us being better educated than ever before?
Yeah, look, it's a great, and again, I think I'd point back to, I'm going to echo William Davies on this point out of nervous states. I think the couple of points to be made there is this issue of polarisation is quite significant. The other thing is that rightly in terms of postmodernist thinking, there's been more of a critique of the Enlightenment assumption that somehow there is kind of this impartial science and scientists are completely impartial has been legitimately critiqued. You know, if you're taking money from big tobacco to do research into the effects of cigarettes, people rightly question how valid that is. But obviously that then starts extending out in the way people think about it. And the danger is we start moving to the age of opinion, basically. So opinion now, you know, there is then no agreed facts. So I think to answer their question very directly, I think it is this notion that the validity of science has been under critique for legitimate reasons, but has gotten out of control. So what's interesting, I'm trying to think whose book it was, but someone who was, I thought it was George Monbiot, but it might be someone else, was looking at, went and spoke to both, you know, the environment movement in the US campaigning for climate justice, but then also went and spoke to the groups that were climate denialists and said, you know, climate change isn't happening. And they actually say the same thing about each other. So the climate denialists say, oh, those who believe in climate change, the media's on their side, they've got big money behind them, and all the scientists coming out with this stuff are all biased and it's all fake and made up, right? And it's all personal bias from information. So it's interesting that the two sides actually say the same thing actually about that. And I think, you know, one of the roles I would argue that hopefully the Christian community can play is actually trying to bring people back together and actually having sensible conversations out of that and actually recognise it. William Davies points out the dilemma for scientists as being, because from memory, Trump appointed a climate change denialist as, I think, his scientific advisor from memory. I may have the details slightly wrong there. And that resulted in, it was kind of this movement in the US to have these rallies for science. So the idea was scientists would take to the street. And William Davies points out the dilemma in this, because the critique of those attacking science and attacking the whole notion that science is impartial is that science is politicised and biased. So if the scientists go out on the street and march, you're actually fulfilling the prophecy or fulfilling the view that the scientists are political players doing what political players do, which is rally. They're not off as neutral academics. So, you know, so how do the scientists fight back against, or how does the academic endeavour fight back against the accusation that, well, you're all just biased? But the danger, of course, is that accusation gets levelled whenever you just simply disagree with whatever the research says. If I don't like the answer, I simply say the scientist is biased or corrupted or incapable.
And another question from the Zoom audience, again, a question this time from Dr. Helen Hill. Mark, I'm very worried about the relationship with the Pacific. Making an agreement with the US to deploy nuclear warships goes against everything the Pacific Islands have been fighting for 50 years. In the 70s, the Nuclear-Free Pacific movement persuaded the Hawke government to sign a Nuclear-Free Pacific Treaty, and churches were fully behind this. Has this been forgotten?
I think the answer to that is probably yes, to answer Helen's. And I suspect Helen knows a lot more about this topic than I do in terms of the nuclear free. The only comments I would make in that space is obviously what we've seen is the Pacific governments have probably understandably felt that they have not been treated respectfully and as equal players. And particularly, you know, there was quite a lot of debate around the free trade agreements, which again, I know Helen's deep connections to the Pacific, so she would know a lot about this space. But you kind of get a sense that the Pacific Island governments have realised the way they get leverage is to play other governments, China, US, Australia, New Zealand off against each other as a way of potentially getting more leverage. That's my sense of part of the politics in this. And it is them looking at what's in the interests of the Pacific. And that kind of, to my mind, makes sense for them to do that. The question is what what do they actually end up agreeing to do and the consequences in the Pacific. At times, we've certainly would say seen some very worrying decisions that Pacific Island governments have made. For example, given their limited opportunities at economic development, a number of them for some time went into the idea we'll set ourselves up as tax havens. And, a couple of them became quite significant channels for money laundering for criminal proceeds of crime. The issue with tax havens is generally the money that flows through only normally benefits the elites in the tax haven, normally doesn't flow down to the benefit of ordinary people. So it's a really bad model to move down. But that's the worry, that when legitimate opportunities for development and advancement are denied to countries like in the Pacific, they're tempted to try things that are probably not in their interest and not in the interest more globally as well.
Mark, could you explain to me the situation for a new government when there's been commitments made by the exiting government? What power or what responsibility does the new government have to be restrained by that situation? I'm thinking in particular about the tax for the wealthy, which has been put in place by the previous government. I mean, is it just unethical, or is it politically impossible, or what power do they have to alter that sort of situation?
From a political point of view, from a power point of view, they could simply choose to legislate and overturn that. So there's no restriction. I mean, no, there's no restriction they could do it. But I think politically, having made a commitment they were going to honour them, I think it would be difficult politically to do it, because it would be, in the media, they would be lambasted as backflipping and all that. So, their only cover for that might be saying, well, the situation in the economy was different to what we thought it was when we agreed to that, and we can no longer honour what we said we would do, so we're now going to backtrack on that. And you politically could probably get away with that, because you probably do it very early. By the time the next election comes around, you would hope that people have forgotten about it. I mean, the reality is, with the tax cuts that are there, it has a very large impact on government revenue, but for the ordinary wealthy person, the amount of money they're going to get is small change, right, in their overall financial situation. So it's giving away quite a lot of ability for government to spend on things that would really benefit us and make us a better society, in order to give a pretty small amount of money that a lot of wealthy people probably wouldn't even much notice, if honest. I don't know that it would get support, but I suspect that they could get away. I mean, my suspicion is they could get away with it. More broadly on your question, look, a new government can pretty much do what it likes. The only thing that gets a bit more tricky, because it's costly, is if you tear up a contract that's already, so if there's a contract, but you saw it happen with the state Labor government around the East-West tunnel, where they just said we're ripping up the contract, but they had to pay a very large compensation payout. I don't know the exact amount, but from memory it was significant. And that's probably the only one where you pay a price, and you can pay a price. You might pay a price politically if what you're doing is unpopular. But often, the time to do unpopular things for an elected government in our system is pretty much after an election, because you're hoping that people have forgotten about it by the time you come around to the next election. That's not necessarily great, but it's probably the political reality of the situation.
Mark, I've got two different questions I'd like to ask you. The first one is about, what do you think about the media coverage of Aboriginal issues? Just sometimes I think I've been lucky to attend something that's given me a certain trust that in the intervention, for instance. But it's hard for me to make up my mind about something like the CDP. It was interesting and useful just to have you say it's considered not helpful to Aboriginal people, whereas you see so much local communities saying how much they miss having CDP. I don't know what to make of a lot of issues like that.
Okay. Look, the issue with the CDP was effectively it was a scheme that required people to work, and the critique that was coming out of First Nations groups particularly was that you ended up with people having to do jobs that were effectively real jobs but get paid unemployment payments for that. So effectively, instead of saying, well, here's this job in sanitation for the local council, you end up getting paid unemployment rate to do a job that you actually should be paid a proper wage for. So that was you know, one of the major critiques around the CDP. I think, you know, in the First Nations groups are saying, yes, we do want employment programs, and yes, we do want to address levels of unemployment. We just don't want it done through this punitive. And what you were also seeing is the penalties that were, like the rate of penalty that were being applied to First Nations people under the CDP was many times higher than penalties applied to people under the job seeker system. So, you know, and that was the argument about why it was racially discriminatory, because even though the program, look, it did apply to anybody in those remote and regional areas, it didn't just apply to First Nations, but, you know, disproportionately, they were the people affected by the CDP. So it was an unfair system, even by, you know, by comparison to just job seeker. You know, what's being suggested is it's not about getting rid of those opportunities to create employment. It's about redesigning the system with the participation of First Nation groups to make sure you actually get a system that works and is fair and doesn't have these kind of punitive approaches, is the view on that. On your first question about media coverage, look, it varies. I mean, as I would argue for most issues, for a lot of issues, what we see is different media outlets take a different approach. So, you know, the coverage of First Nation issues in The Guardian, for example, if you read The Guardian online, is going to be worlds apart from most of the coverage you will see in The Australian or The Herald Sun. So, you know, and then it depends on exactly what issue. So it's kind of been interesting to watch, you know, just in this last week, The Herald Sun has really been critiquing the state government about not doing enough to check up on kinship arrangements. Now, you know, the code there is kinship arrangements. While they cover broadly in the community, I think most people would know they impact on First Nations communities here as well. So it kind of becomes this subtle critique. And that's probably what disturbs me about some of the News Corp coverage of First Nations issues, is there's this sort of subtle, from my perspective, dog whistling going on. You know, so you'll have their opinion columnists saying, you know, lefty human rights defenders don't care about family violence in First Nations communities, with this kind of undercurrent of, you know, First Nations people inherently are bad people is the underlying notion, without any sort of analysis about, well, what's the historical effect of colonialism been? What, you know, historical entrenched structural disadvantages there that might be causing, you know, if there are higher rates of family violence or other problems, what might be the causes and drivers? Now, that's not an unreasonable conversation to have, but in the way some of these News Corp columnists frame the debate, I think it's really negative and, you know, from my perspective, very unethical in the whole way they're wanting to frame it. So if you're asking me about, like, I think if you look at the media outlets, you're going to get very different responses and sensitivities around some of these issues.
Thank you. And the other one was, do you think this government will be more amenable to the range of religious ideas? I guess I'm thinking specifically Christian concerns. Would they rather we too kept quiet, or, you know?
Look, my experience across the political parties is, I think, so I can only speak, so I'll speak to my experience as a church, you know, paid church staff person. I tend to find we're judged on our merits by and large. So you get a good hearing if you've actually got something worthwhile to bring to the conversation. Some people who, you know, might be church members themselves, might be more inclined to give the church view more of an in. Some people who might be, you know, deeply hold a view of, you know, not just being an atheist, but an anti-religious atheist. And I draw that, there's a distinction there where, you know, I'm biased I actually think Christianity is a negative force in society, or I think religion's a negative force in society, then you're going to have a harder time having those conversations. But, you know, even in state politics, I think about this, we have worked with and had, you know, supported Fiona Patten on a number of positive reforms she's done, and we've been able to have sensible conversations with her. At the same time, I think, you know, I wouldn't be incorrect to say, you know, she at times has not had a positive view of churches and, you know, has taken that. But I think if churches go with a view that, well, because we're churches, we should have some sort of special right or some special position in terms of engaging with politicians, I think those days are by and large diminished. And yeah, by and large, it's the merits of the arguments. I mean, look, some people obviously are very notable public figures. I'm thinking here, Tim Costello probably gets quite a lot of access to politicians, and some of that will be the wisdom of what he's got to say. Some of that will also, I think, be because of his high public profile that he's earned over that period of time as well. So that's probably a difference there. But if I think about, you know, people get very concerned about the role of the Australian Christian lobby. When I actually think about the things they've gone after, I'm not seeing, unless I've missed something, I'm not seeing reforms that they've actually been able to achieve. They've made a bit of noise, but I don't actually think on most issues that they've gone after, they've actually been able to make a difference. Whereas I think, certainly I might be sounding a bit arrogant here, but I think, you know, for some of us in the sort of mainstream churches, where we've engaged in issues in a serious way, we've actually been able to influence some of the outcomes, you know, from my perspective, in a positive way. So that would be the kind of view. I think my personal view is I think Bill Shorten made a bit of a misstep in the last election. He did, I think the Labor Party probably tried to make a bit of an issue about Scott Morrison's Pentecostalism. And my understanding of the analysis that I heard post-election was that sort of backfired on them, that it actually pushed. And anecdotally, I heard that as well. I heard people who would have otherwise voted Labor said, oh, I'm a bit concerned that a Shorten government will be hostile to the churches. So I actually voted Liberal at the last election. And I think the analysis showed that. This last election, I think they ignored that. It's interesting to see some church people are wanting to bring back this issue of religious discrimination, religious freedom. I'll be interested to see whether a Labor government wants to play with that. I actually think it's quite difficult space. And I suspect the people who are pursuing that, it will be very hard for any government to deliver what they want in the way they want it. So it's kind of, if you play in that space, I suspect for any government, you're probably not going to satisfy anybody and take a lot of damage on the way through. So it would be, like I said, I don't know whether they want to play in that space or not, or whether the religious groups can get together and come up with a more consistent, agreed position. That'll wait and see. But, you know, the church I'm coming from, the Uniting Church, was generally of the view, you know, did take a public position to say what was being put up before around the religious discrimination bill was not something they were very comfortable with. I think that, you know, you can look at the public statements in that space.
I'm interested that you are focusing largely on political and economic aspects. It occurs to me that what we really need to be focusing on is the attitude of people in government office, people in various ways working to improve conditions and to resolve them. I'll give you an example. I happened to be in Broome a number of years ago. There was a friendly cricket match on between two state teams. One side of the ground, there is the local squattocracy, big business, whatever, all sitting in their separate little area, drinking their heads off. Outside, where it's basically just the general public, including members of our First Nations people, every so often, the local police would come along. If you had anything, if your skin was any darker than a decent sunburn, your drink was taken from you, thrown away, poured into the gutter. There were a couple of Indian people in the crowd who were most upset about that. So what did the Indigenous people do? They retreated to the toilets. What happened then? Police came along every so often and closed the toilets, and from the noises that were coming inside, And when you did manage to get into the toilet, the amount of blood that was on the floor, quite frankly, it's an attitude in terms of public offices. Same thing in Port Hedland. There's only one public drinking tap in the town. It happens to be in the Tourist Bureau. And so as the afternoon goes on, you get elderly women coming in wanting to have a drink of water, and they get thrown out. You know, we need to change our thinking attitudes towards these people and then address it, remembering particularly that the ones who are probably our biggest hope are the grandmothers within the tribal groups.
Look, I would agree with you. I don't think it's to my mind, it's not an either or though. So I actually think churches, Christian community can play, and religious communities generally can play a positive role in terms of social change and structural change. It depends where they want to play. And at times, I think for this movement, you'd be well aware that churches haven't and religious people haven't always played a positive role in some of those social changes as well. So, there is an ability to do that, and I think that's really important. Social change is hard though. Social changing culture is quite difficult. It's not something you can just set out centrally to make happen. You might nudge it in certain directions, but frankly, I've spent a lot of time reading about cultural change, and I'm still yet to really understand how, why things shift in particular directions or the belief. I'm probably concerned that some of my civil society colleagues sort of think that, well, if I say something long enough, society will change in that direction. Or if a change happens, well, it was because of my action. I kind of feel at times that's a little bit like saying, because I put my surfboard in the sea, I made the waves happen. Right? So I kind of think cultural change is quite difficult. It's quite hard. But I think we can play a role at the local level. We can play a role within our own lives around the people. And then governments can also play a role in that cultural change. So the way governments set direction, what they publicise, the way they talk about things, the way they frame things, does set that cultural tone. It makes some things acceptable, some things not. It helps empower certain parties within society and perhaps disempower others. So it's a question, there are those things. So I don't think they're separate from each other. I think that is all connected, part of that complexity that I started talking about right at the beginning. So yes, I think I'm agreeing with you, but I'm saying it requires more as well. It actually does require intervention from the political level and, resourcing in that space as well. And that can be across governments. I mean, we see really positive stuff at times from local governments now have inclusion officers or multicultural development officers, or, and so you're seeing shifts across different structures in government. I mean, I spoke before about, we've got a state government that moved on Treaty and Truth Commission well before the Commonwealth did, right? We've seen states move on setting targets for net zero emissions well before the Commonwealth did, right? So different levels of government can also drive change, but you're right to say change can also happen and needs to happen at the local level and needs to happen through culture as well. It's just getting that cultural shift is a very difficult thing to make happen. There's not an easy way to have that come about.
Thank you. I think Mark's given us good value today. Thank you very much for what you've said to us and your willingness to engage in question and answer and giving your opinions without fear or favour, which we do appreciate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a little something in appreciation.